All right, here's the second lesson of our Cold War at home, the response to the Red Scare by the United States government and Americans. Check out this clip on this oldie but goodie, The Day the Earth Stood Still. This kind of film and the poster that you see here, as well as the posters of the films from the 1950s that you see here. Actually, this one originating much earlier than that, in the late 1890s, published into books multiple times, and then also actually turned into a radio program that scared the heck out of Americans in the 1930s, resulting in a congressional hearing and investigation about what was behind this story of the War of the Worlds that really made people think that aliens were coming. All these films were a bit of a reflection of Americans' fears at home. And the movies, being ever popular for a couple decades now, had tons and tons of films that were of this kind of a theme. And so the reflection is outside invaders, aliens, i.e. communists, are coming to get us. And that's what we were experiencing at home. We were seeing in the movie theaters, except it was all kind of centered around aliens. And this is about the time period that the whole Roswell event happens in the southwest part of the United States, Arizona, New Mexico. I forget which place it particularly is, but something crashed there, and the United States government said it was some sort of an experiment with balloons or whatever. But there was this notion that there were aliens out there. And Hollywood was portraying that. Kind of reflects what was going on in people's heads. But in reality, our concern is the Red Scare, communism. And you would see it pretty much everywhere, and it was in everything in the news constantly. There's constant fears of communist subversion, sabotage. There are some examples of it, real-life evidence of it. There's knowledge that the Soviets have the atomic bomb. That happened in 1949, the Berlin airlift in 1848. China falls to communism in 1949. The North Koreans invade South Korea in 1950, and resulting in the Korean War in 1953. It's spreading. It's coming for us. What are we going to do to stop it? All that kind of thing. It really takes over America's psychology and thinking. It directly impacts how we live. Nobody's safe. There are spies amongst us. One of the ways in which we try to deal with concerns about spies amongst us is to make sure they're not within our leadership or our federal government. And in 1947, Truman issues an executive order 9835 that says every federal agency shall have a conducted investigation and questionings, interrogations, you might say, of who's a communist and who's not. Are you a member of the Communist Party? Do you know somebody who's a member of the Communist Party? We know you're a friend with so-and-so, and that so-and-so is a communist or has socialist thinking, that kind of thing. This maybe comes about because Truman was considered to be and getting criticized heavily for being soft on communists, everything that was happening in 1948 and 49, the spread of communism in Asia especially. And so we have these loyalty committees established in every federal agency. About 6 million people are surveyed, and thousands lose their job and or resign. People are required to take loyalty oaths, as the one you see here. Even in other places of American society, teachers would be required to take loyalty oaths as well before they could take a job teaching children, things like that. But this fear of spies and communism goes well beyond and even before World War II and the post-Red Scare Part 2 era. It happens and is starting in Red Scare Part 1, which is from about 1919. Soviet Union is established by Lenin. The Communist Revolution is successful, and there's this fear of radicals, anarchists, communists coming for the rest of the world. And that was kind of the ideology of the Soviet Union. But the House of Un-American Activities Committee should be formed in about 1936. You can make the adjustment there on the screen. Was an investigative committee in the United States Congress, in the House of Representatives. And they were out there to investigate communist subversion. And quite often these investigations involving government workers and civilians in the United States accused of being and associating and promoting communist thinking and or events and or maybe spying resulted in quite a bit of guilt by association, quite a ruckus. It was basically a witch hunt overall in the 1950s, but this is one of the areas in which it occurred, or one of the parts of the federal government occurred. And so this particular event in this committee very much turned out to be an example of the federal government stepping on people's civil liberties and civil rights, privileges of privacy, First Amendment rights, things of that nature, freedom of protest, freedom of the right to assemble or organize, that kind of thing, were issues of civil liberties being affected. One of the big focuses and activities that the HUAC committee was involved with was a series of interrogations of Hollywood actors, screenwriters, producers, directors, who tended to, in many people's minds and perhaps in reality, be more on the liberal viewpoint politically of things. And perhaps some were members of the Communist Party or the socialist organizations. But they were interrogated and brought before the United States Congress, and they were basically had their names splashed all over the newspapers, accused of being communists, whether they were actually a part of the Communist Party or not, but also associated maybe with those who were. And because of that association, their names got put on things called blacklists. And in Hollywood or in any other industry, sometimes these blacklists were put together throughout society, and if your name was on it as a person who was associated with a communist organization or was maybe a troublemaker, socialist-minded, perhaps even union-minded, and union blacklists existed before this as well, as we'll talk about in the Industrial Revolution. You would basically not be able to get a job, and your career and livelihood was destroyed because of this. And so the Hollywood 10 was a series of individuals that were in particular impacted by this blacklisting. Nancy Davis / Reagan was an actress who met her husband Ronald Reagan as a person who was going to be blacklisted for her association or thoughts or ideals, whatever have you. And Ronald Reagan was actually interrogated and testified in front of the HUAC committee. He was an actor at that time in the 1950s, and he was also the president of the Screen Actors Guild. The Screen Actors Guild, union for actors. And she was able to, with his help, get off of that blacklist, and they became associated with each other, and they decided to get married. Little history connection there to the more recent times. But there really were some spies in the United States. As in World War II, there were Nazi spies. In World War I, there were German spies. There are spies. And the Soviet Union had them here. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were connected in 1951, were convicted of espionage and having given atomic bomb information to the Soviet Union. Julius worked with the Army Corps of Engineers as an electrical engineer, and was found to have conveyed information that could have helped them develop that. He and his wife were convicted in 1917 under the Espionage Act, and both were executed in 1953 by the electric chair. However, in present-day reviews and recent investigations about how the trial was conducted, it perhaps wasn't the best in terms of due process and the punishment for the crime. It's pretty much agreed upon that it has been, it was a punishment that was far too excessive, and that his wife, Ethel, was not involved in any of this passing of information. So hysteria is a dangerous thing. It definitely impacts people's lives, literally in this case, but civil liberties, daily life in general as well, but with the Rosenbergs way overboard. The 1948 Alger Hiss case was another example of this as well. I'm jumping around just a little bit. Just fix it in your notes there. That happened before this was also another HUAC investigative hearing, and Alger Hiss was a Department of State employee, and he was convicted of lying to Congress about his involvement with socialism and or socialist thinking and communist thinking, and was he helping, was he an agent of the United States government and all that kind of thing. He goes to prison for a few years, and a particular person that was significant in those hearings, and that particular event was future President Richard Nixon, will be famous for hunting communists. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, a Republican from Wisconsin, addressed the Senate and said, "I have knowledge that there are 205 card-carrying communist members who work in the United States Department of State." This is the department that conducts foreign relations with foreign countries. And so the Senate launches this series of investigative hearing for the better part of about 4 years, interrogating people. And this becomes the real scenario of extreme fear that develops in the 1950s out of these accusations. All of the accusations were declared without a single proof of solid evidence. Much of it was, as you can see by the cartoon here, was doctored and faked and made up, came up with grand props with details about where communist activity was and where they were located, all that kind of thing. And as that's all going on, this results in further legislation being passed as a response to Alger Hiss, the Rosenberg trial, and the accusations of McCarthy. And that piece of legislation being passed is the McCarran Act. And the McCarran Act required that everybody who was a communist had to register with the United States government. Now, if you admitted to that, that might not be a very smart thing to do, but it was going to allow for the president to arrest those deemed to be suspicious and to basically kick them out of the country, imprison them, whatever. Truman did not like it at all. He thought it was far too much power to be given to the president and dangerous to our society and civil liberties, so he vetoes it. But the veto is overridden by Congress by 2/3. This hysteria is manifest, and it shows up in other ways in film and literature in the 1950s. And one way is in Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which was a popular play that used the Salem witch trials in 1692 as a metaphor for McCarthyism and how hysteria goes wild and is dangerous to our freedom and our society and people and causes us to turn on one another. The McCarthy hearings ultimately end in a series of 36 televised hearings. It was seen on TV, live TV, by people across the country. And toward the end, in the last several hearings, McCarthy basically accuses the United States military generals and top military leaders as being communists as well. And when that happens, McCarthy pretty much loses all attention from people, and the United States Senate votes to censure him for misconduct, abusing his power, things of that nature. But it was really too late. There was a significant amount of cost to this and ruined lives of people. And from this time period and in the aftermath to the present day, whenever you have somebody who throws out false accusations with no evidence behind it and no real accuracy behind it at all, with the intent of furthering your agenda or a particular agenda or your power or your position or your notoriety, it becomes known as, or is called, McCarthyism, right? Using unfair allegations and investigations to advance your agenda and own purposes. So this is a significant period of time in history, and of course we have the way in which people live exemplified, being changed very strongly here with the advertisements that show up in newspapers and magazines on how to build your own bomb shelter, to buy one from a company and they'll help you build it, things of that nature, how to store things in it, what to store, how long things are good for. Occupancy tests were done during this time in history to see how long people could live in those conditions and what life would be like. Of course, in Britain and in World War II, people lived in London in conditions like this when the Nazis were bombing London. The United States government makes and creates a huge advertising campaign on how to prepare for nuclear war, how to respond to a nuclear attack. And just like a tornado drill or a fire drill or a code yellow or code red drill in school today, they were practicing on how to duck and cover in the event of an atomic blast or an atomic invasion. Make sure you watch that. Google search that, duck and cover. You'll see what they saw back then on TV in the 1950s. Make sure you do your left side reflection for this unit and for this lesson and lesson 1. It's just a basic simple mind map. You should have those subjects there, but make sure that you add the details about what these things were all about on the outside reaches of them, so that you can see that you've looked at and reviewed your notes and you've described what they were, why they were important, their impact, their characteristics, that kind of thing. That's the end of the lesson. Have a good day. Goodbye.